Hello, and welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. On this episode, it's going to be a little bit different today. I'm going to discuss the story of love, loss, and grief, a 27-year dynamic love story. It's about one of my clients, with permission from him to do so. Some details and names have been changed to protect certain identities and their locations. I'm going to tell you about a client I've been treating over this last year. It's touching, sad, moving, a connection through BDSM, what a dynamic truly means, and what it means when you truly love someone. John was a dominant and master from a different era. When guides were being written by those living the lifestyle in the shadows of their homes, sharing techniques and private parties, and the thoughts of BDSM and the lifestyle were only spoke in soft hush undertones. John was the type of man whose quiet demeanor and presence not only emulated respect within his community, but also garnered plenty of it. A child of the 50s, John had known from his early adolescent years that he was different when it came to relationships, that the status quo of the time was not for him, that pleasure, in all of its aspects, for him, was to be explored. His journey began. He had picked up some flyers and personal ads back in the day when the internet just wasn't a thing, and found references to the lifestyle. From there, John started to learn, reading books and interacting with a small community to learn more about BDSM. John wasn't exactly sure what everything was, their proper names, or how to go about it all, but he knew this was his calling. John, as he tells it, trained and explored the lifestyle over the next 8 years, learning the art of rope bondage, fascinated by whips, learning what and how to conduct interrogation scenes, and eventually he found his foray into sadomasochism. John learned and trained from 2 different masters, how to control and channel his focus, how to work with a submissive, how to conduct safety and first aid, and so much more. Over time, John began a search for a submissive, someone to complete his other half. John, during a private event, met his wife, his future sub, his future slave. He met Michelle at this party. They hit it off, as John tells it, almost instantly. Their conversations and negotiations, as John told me, were involved with a 4-month back-and-forth exercise in compromise, negotiations, and understandings. As they moved through the years, they had a beautiful wedding and a formal celebration ceremony in front of their closest friends and family at a small dungeon they eventually purchased in the southeast part of the United States. Michelle was a typical Southern belle, demure and reserved, but found solace in the lifestyle. As she described it, she knew that living something prim and proper wasn't for her. Growing up in a conservative and religious family, especially in those times, sex wasn't so much about the pleasure as it was more out of necessity. The middle daughter of 4, she felt a little lost in the confusion of her big family life. But as she tells it, her father's military experience and strict regimen was one part that always had a draw for her. As Michelle grew older, she eventually went off to college, not really having many relationships, but even inside of those false connections, she knew what she was looking for wasn't there. For Michelle, there was a need to pull on something more, and it wasn't until a random Tuesday night with a friend of hers that was going to a beginner class for new submissives in the lifestyle that she discovered the part of her life she knew was missing for so long. She was nervous at first, but that nervousness and reservation was met with wild anticipation for what was next, what she could experience, what she could learn about. How a life of structure and service greatly appealed to Michelle. While her girlfriend said it wasn't for her, Michelle described it as finding her new family and something that rounded out her life, and continued going to different events. It was about 4 years later when her and John met. Not many years her senior, they embarked on a journey that rivals many understandings of the lifestyle. They created classes together, they trained, they evolved, they pushed boundaries. They wrote manuscripts, and they found their connection as BDSM became the way they shared their joy for the world. They traveled in the 90s and the early 2000s, giving demonstrations and talks in countries all over the world, sharing their experience and arts they've learned over the decades. They truly were a pinnacle of essence of what one hopes to aspire to in a BDSM and relationship dynamic. As the years went on, they had different endeavors. They sold their dungeon and decided to live in their continued MS dynamic together. The last few years, especially with the COVID pandemic raging, Michelle was diagnosed with terminal cancer. While exploring their options, they were given a range of time and realized what was before them. Michelle reached out to me, from an acquaintance that we both have, and counseling began. It was the first time for me in dealing with grief for something that was imminent. While I sometimes saw them together, there were times I saw them separately. Michelle was worried for John's state of mind and his health. Her concerns that her ability to continue to serve and do her duties, as she stated, as a submissive, as a slave, as his wife, would be diminished. As the disease took its toll, her fears manifested, and she became more and more bedridden. John, while ever the dominant in his stature and presence, had a notable shift. Not only had he been her husband, her master, her provider, and her lover for all of these decades, he took on a new role, that of carer. John never wavered. Every doctor's appointment, every medicine she required, whenever she got sick in the night, and more, John took care of her. During her last few months, when things got really bad, and I was seeing John more regularly, the mental and emotional exhaustion were beginning to take its toll. I could see a noticeable change in his behavior and his responses to me. During one of our sessions, out of concern, I decided to ask John why he looked so exhausted, and I also suggested it may be time for him to think about maybe having a live-in nurse or putting Michelle in a care facility to help shoulder the load. John, while ever thankful and appreciative for the suggestions I had raised, shrugged those ideas off. He said she was his responsibility, that she was his to protect and care for, that his responsibilities as her husband and as her master far exceeded his own physical exhaustion. He would rest once he knew Michelle was comfortable. As I pressed during one session to the level of his physical exhaustion and why he looked so tired, as this had not always been the case in the months prior, John opened up about something truly and deeply personal. John said something to me that left me in awe. During the last few months of Michelle's life, John drove a 3-hour round trip to get Michelle a hometown treat that she had loved and adored throughout the years of her early childhood. Because the pandemic had closed so many businesses, not just in the States but globally, John had a bit of a challenge on his hands. He found out he used to own the store, but sadly they had passed away in 2014. Their daughter took over the business, but when the pandemic hit, she closed her doors. John made an arrangement with her and drove every day across state lines in the last few months to get Michelle her childhood treat, to make her more comfortable. John had said, as Michelle's memories began to fog, he wanted to make her as comfortable as possible. In the last few weeks, John really wasn't taking care of himself physically, emotionally, or even mentally. I understood the pain. I understood his heartache, but had to recommend again that he seek further help, that he did no good for Michelle if he couldn't take care of himself. He had this smile about him, and even in his tired and weakened state, he said okay, but I knew that advice had fell on deaf ears. As we continued to speak, Michelle was no longer able to be part of our sessions. I asked how he was managing and she was feeling. The pain of losing his partner is insurmountable. I feel John and Michelle knew the time was coming. I woke up one morning. I had an email from John asking if I could call him urgently. While not out of the ordinary for me, this was a bit of a strange request from John. John was sullen, and I knew when I heard his voice that Michelle had passed. He expressed it in a few words, not a man of many these past few months. He asked if we could reschedule our appointment for the following week while he was making arrangements for Michelle. A couple of weeks went by. I had not heard from John. I would send some follow-up emails and calls that went unreturned. In my last message to John, I said, when you are ready, I'm here to listen. A month went by. John reached out. He asked me, what's he supposed to do now? What does he do with the life he built with his wife, his submissive, his slave, his partner? I heard this man break down and his heart poured out. As we've been working through his stages of grief and how he's processing it, he's never wavered in his love for Michelle. He tells me their stories, their journeys, about their incredible life. This dominant man put all that aside to take care of her. Because after building this life with her, their relationship, their marriage, their dynamic, in the end, he wanted to repay her for the life she provided for him, for the memories she afforded to him. While John is still processing his loss, dealing with his grief and what comes ahead, John demonstrated not only what a good man should do, what a good dominant should do, what a good husband should do, what a good person should do. John demonstrated devotion and resolution because this dynamic with Michelle was built on devotion and trust to one another. This is something we can all hope to aspire to and desire in a partner, not only in the BDSM community, but life in general. That it does not stop when times are bad, we only relish the good, that we can be better when things get very difficult, that we have to learn being responsible for another sometimes goes beyond our own needs. That, to me, is the moral of this story. Until next time, be safe and stay kinky.